Have you ever found yourself, yelling at a stubbed toe or maybe cursing out your laptop when it crashes right before a major deadline?
Oh, absolutely. I think we all do that.
Because I did this just yesterday. I was staring at a completely frozen screen and I literally shouted, "Why are you doing this to me?"
Right. Like it's out to get you.
Exactly. As if this inanimate piece of aluminum and silicon had a personal vendetta against my productivity. It's entirely irrational. But why do our brains automatically assign a personality or, an intention to a piece of metal or a piece of furniture?
It's a really fascinating quirk of human behavior, actually. It happens across literally every culture on Earth. We treat the world around us as if it has a mind of its own.
Right.
We negotiate with our cars to start on a cold morning. We see faces in the clouds or the pattern of burnt toast. We assume the universe is somehow reacting to our personal choices.
Which is exactly why we are here today. So, welcome to the deep dive. For those of you tuning in, we have a massive, absolutely fascinating stack of research papers and talks in front of us by humanist, pastor, and researcher James Dalton.
It's a really incredible body of work.
It really is. And our mission today is to uncover how the stories we hear, whether they are grand cultural epics, religious traditions, or national myths, how they combine with the ancient evolutionary wiring of our brains to secretly program our daily behaviors.
Yeah, the hidden matrix, essentially.
Okay, let's unpack this because we are going to tear down the artificial walls between cognitive biology, ancient mythology, and modern political tension to see that hidden matrix of human belief. We're looking at how these narratives shape massive global societies, and perhaps most surprisingly, how they dictate the quiet, critical, inner self-talk echoing in your own head right now.
To even begin decoding that matrix, though, we really have to start with the hardware.
The biological hardware.
Exactly. Before we can understand the epic myths or the grand religious narratives that govern whole societies, we have to look at the wetware inside our skulls that actually processes them.
Mm.
We need to answer a really fundamental, seemingly simple question. Why are human beings so incredibly prone to believing in unseen forces in the first place?
Right, because Dalton points out that this isn't just some accident or a cognitive glitch. We didn't just invent ghosts or unseen spirits because we were sitting around bored.
No, not at all.
It is a deeply ingrained survival mechanism, and he focuses heavily on this concept of hyperactive agency detection. Now, I've seen this term thrown around in evolutionary psychology, but how does it actually govern my behavior today?
Well, to really grasp hyperactive agency detection, I want you to put yourself in the bare feet of our ancient ancestors for a second.
Okay, I'm there.
Picture yourself walking through the African savanna, say 100,000 years ago. The grass is tall, the sun is setting, and suddenly the bushes directly to your right start violently rustling.
My immediate biological response is, that's a predator. A leopard's about to jump out and eat me. I need to run.
Right, and that split-second jump to a conclusion is the exact mechanism at work. In evolutionary biology, this is framed through something called error management theory.
Error management theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We constantly have to weigh the cost of false positives versus false negatives. If you assume that the rustling bush is a predator, meaning an agent with an intention to harm you, and you sprint away, but it turns out it was just a random gust of wind.
The cost to me is practically zero.
Exactly. You burned a few calories running away, and maybe you look a little silly in front of your tribe. That is a false positive.
Just a minor inconvenience for survival.
But flip the scenario.
Yeah.
You hear the rustle, and you assume it's just the mindless wind. You ignore it. But it actually is a leopard.
Then I'm lunch.
You are lunch. That is a false negative, and the cost of that error is your life. You are removed from the gene pool entirely. So over millions of years, evolution rigorously, ruthlessly selected for brains that overdetect agency.
Because the paranoid ones survived.
Right. We are literally hardwired by the brutal math of natural selection to assume that a rustling bush has an intention, a mind behind it, rather than just a physical random cause.
That makes total sense from a survival standpoint. We survive by assuming that someone or something is out to get us. But what Dalton is arguing is that this survival mechanism didn't just stay in the savannah.
No, it scaled up.
Yeah, as we evolved and our brains grew more complex, that hyperactive agency detection completely infiltrated how we view the entire universe. We see intention and patterns where there is only randomness. If a massive storm hits a coastal village, instead of our brains calmly concluding, well, the atmospheric pressure shifted over the ocean, our ancient savanna brains immediately say, Who did we anger?
Who sent this storm?
Right, this is a divine punishment.
And this ties directly into another psychological phenomenon Dalton explores, which is called the theory of mind.
Theory of mind.
Yeah, theory of mind is our uniquely human ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, feelings, and motivations that are entirely separate from our own.
Oh, like when toddlers finally realize that hiding their eyes doesn't mean you can't see them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It usually develops in toddlers around age 3 or 4. It's the cognitive foundation of empathy, cooperation, and even social deception. But because our brains are already so over-indexed on detecting agency from our days on the savannah, we take this theory of mind and we begin to project it outward onto things that do not have human minds.
And this brings us right back to me yelling at my laptop. It's anthropomorphism. We instinctively project our own human thoughts, our own emotions onto animals, onto the weather, and eventually onto the vast universe itself.
Yes.
It's our brain's default mode to project human intent onto chaos because chaos is terrifying.
What's fascinating here is the profound emotional and psychological payoff that comes with that projection. We often forget that human beings are uniquely burdened by our own cognition. Well, thanks to our advanced frontal lobes, we are the only species on Earth that is acutely, painfully aware of our own mortality. You know you are going to die. I know I am going to die.
Right, it's the ultimate deadline.
Exactly. And we are constantly faced with a universe that is vast, infinite, cold, and entirely unpredictable. In psychology, this is explored through terror management theory. The awareness of our own inevitable death is a heavy, almost unbearable psychological burden that creates this constant, low-level existential terror.
I mean, it is terrifying to just sit and think about the sheer scale of the cosmos compared to one 80-year human life. It really feels like we are just dust floating in a void.
So what does a brain equipped with hyperactive agency detection do to cope with that terror? We use that theory of mind, and we create gods, spirits, and cosmic forces in our own image. We anthropomorphize the universe.
Because it makes it smaller.
Precisely. Because an anthropomorphic, relatable god, essentially a cosmic parent figure who gets angry, who loves, who makes plans, who listens to your pleas, that is infinitely less terrifying than a cold, random, empty void.
It gives it a face.
It fulfills a deep, foundational human need for security and order. You are taking the infinite, which the human brain cannot actually process, and you are shrinking it down into a mental shortcut that feels manageable, familial, and familiar.
We manufacture meaning just to survive the psychological weight of existence. I love that. But here is where Dalton's work shifts gears from individual psychology to societal architecture, and it gets really intense.
It really does.
Because we naturally project human intent onto the cosmos, we don't just leave it as a private, comforting thought. We build elaborate, multi-generational narratives around these forces. But these aren't just bedtime stories to help us sleep at night. According to Dalton, they are actual mechanisms for behavioral programming.
This is where the biological hardware meets the cultural software. We are constantly being conditioned by the narratives that surround us, often without us having any conscious awareness that the programming is even taking place.
So the story is the code.
Right. The stories a culture tells itself are essentially the code that dictates how the individuals in that culture will behave.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to understand how this conditioning actually works on a neurological level. Let's start with classical conditioning. Anyone who has taken a Psychology 101 class remembers Pavlov's dogs, right?
Oh, yeah. The classic example.
Pavlov rings a bell every time he feeds his dogs. The dogs naturally salivate when they see food, but eventually the dogs start salivating just at the sound of the bell, even if there is absolutely no food in sight. Their brains have completely wired the auditory stimulus of a bell to the physical, biological experience of eating. And Dalton applies this exact mechanism to human stories.
Think about it from the perspective of neuroplasticity. There is a famous axiom in neuroscience. Neurons that fire together, wire together.
Hebbian learning.
Right, Hebbian learning. When a child hears a culturally significant story over and over again, let's say it's a story about a brave hero who sacrifices themselves to help others, the child's brain is undergoing classical conditioning. The abstract concepts of bravery and helpfulness are constantly being paired with the positive emotional rewards of the story.
So they get a literal chemical reward in their brain.
Exactly. They feel the thrill of the hero's triumph, they feel the warmth of the narrative resolution, and they receive the social approval of the parents who are telling the story. Over time, those neural pathways literally, physically fuse in the brain. The child's brain wires those cultural values directly to positive emotional states and a spike in dopamine.
So when they act bravely in the real world later on, they get that same dopamine hit that they felt when listening to the story.
That's the programming at work.
And Dalton also brings in operant conditioning, which is the other side of the coin. Operant conditioning is all about rewards and punishments modifying behavior after a choice is made, and this is heavily utilized in religious narratives.
Operant conditioning in this context is incredibly potent because it leverages our deepest survival fears. Religious narratives often feature stark ultimate consequences. Concepts like divine punishment, bad karma, or an eternal hell create deep, visceral negative associations in the brain,
Right, they trigger that savannah fear again.
specifically activating the amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center. The narrative is designed to deter bad behavior by making the stakes infinitely high. If you lie or steal, you don't just risk getting in trouble with your neighbor or going to jail. You risk eternal, unending suffering or the literal wrath of the creator of the universe.
And on the flip side, concepts like heaven, enlightenment, or divine favor offer ultimate rewards, which reinforces obedience to the group's moral code. The story is the delivery mechanism for the psychological reward or punishment. But Dalton emphasizes that it's not just the rules that condition us, it's the imagery.
Imagery is the absolute secret weapon of narrative conditioning. If you just hand someone a list of rules, they process it with their prefrontal cortex. That's the logical, analytical, slow-thinking part of the brain.
The boring part.
Right. It can evaluate the rule, debate the rule, or ignore the rule entirely. But a story bypasses the prefrontal cortex almost completely.
And the sources bring up the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Christian tradition to illustrate this. If you boil that story down to a moral rule, it's just be nice to people you don't know, even if they are different from you.
Which is pretty forgettable.
Yeah, you can write that on a piece of paper, but a written rule doesn't stick in the human mind. Instead, the narrative gives you vivid, gripping imagery. You have a man beaten, stripped, and left half dead on a dangerous, dusty road. Important religious people walk right past him and ignore him. But an unexpected outsider, a Samaritan, someone who was culturally despised at the time, stops. He physically bandages his bloody wounds, puts him on his own animal, and pays for his medical care.
That vivid imagery activates the brain in a completely different way. It engages the sensory cortexes and the hippocampus, where emotional memories are stored. You aren't just memorizing a dry ethical guideline, you are mentally simulating the experience.
You feel it.
You feel the injustice of the people walking by. You feel the compassion of the Samaritan. The imagery bypasses your logical filters and implants itself permanently in the brain's association matrix. It becomes an emotional memory, which is statistically much more likely to drive your future behavior than a memorized rule.
I am struggling to see the bridge here, though, and I have to push back a little on behalf of the listener. If our brains are this susceptible to classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and emotional imagery, are we just biological robots?
That's a fair question.
I mean, are we basically just meat computers being passively programmed by ancient fables and whoever happens to hold the microphone?
It's a critical question, and it's one that cognitive anthropologists debate constantly. But Dalton clarifies that, no, it is not a one-way street where culture simply downloads into an empty human vessel.
Yeah.
He introduces the concept of gene culture, coevolution.
Gene culture, coevolution.
Yeah. We aren't passive receptacles. It is a dynamic, continuous, thousands of years long feedback loop between our biology and our culture.
How does that loop actually work, like mechanically?
Well, our genes gave us the initial capacity and the desperate psychological need for meaning, pattern recognition, and social connection. We then used those biological tools to create cultural stories to satisfy those needs. But here is the twist. Over hundreds of generations, those cultural stories actually alter our physical environment and our social structures.
Okay, right.
And those new social structures change the evolutionary pressures on the next generation. The culture literally influences which human traits are evolutionarily successful.
So if a society creates a powerful story that highly values cooperation, the people who are biologically predisposed to be highly cooperative will thrive. They'll reproduce and pass on those genes. The culture shapes the biology, and then the altered biology creates even more complex culture.
Exactly. It is an intricate, deeply intertwined dance, not a robotic programming session.
Okay, so we build the stories, and then the stories build us. But how does that scale up? Because I get why I might need a comforting story to fall asleep, and I get how a parable might condition a child to share their toys. But it's an entirely different thing to understand how these personal narratives scale up to build massive temples, coordinate millions of people, and forge entire empires. How does my personal bedtime story become the social glue for, like, the Roman Empire?
It becomes social glue through the embodied power of repetition and ritual. We established that stories have to bypass the logical brain to take root, right?
Yeah.
Well, ritual is the mechanism by which a story moves from being an abstract concept in your head into an embodied reality in your physical life. Dalton emphasizes that religious and cultural rituals, things like prayers, fasting, kneeling, singing in unison, or taking long pilgrimages, these are not just symbolic window
They
dressing.
aren't just for show.
Exactly. They are embodied actions that physically lock the narrative into the nervous system.
It's physical repetition. You aren't just thinking about a belief. Your muscles, your breath, your heart rate, and your physical endurance are actively participating in it. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating concepts in this entire stack of research, which is costly signaling.
Costly signaling is an absolute cornerstone of evolutionary sociology, particularly when looking at how human groups survive. If you have a group of people relying on each other for survival, hunting together, defending territory together, your biggest threat is often internal. It's the freeloader problem.
Oh, the freeloader problem. The person who wants all the protection, the food, and the resources of the group, but who mysteriously disappears when it's time to do the hard work or risk their life for the tribe.
Precisely. Evolutionary game theory dictates that a group full of freeloaders will collapse.
Mhm.
So how does an ancient society weed out the freeloaders and guarantee loyalty? You can't just ask people, hey, are you loyal? Because a freeloader will just lie.
Of course they will.
Instead, you create a ritual that is so arduous, so time-consuming, or so physically demanding that only a true, deeply committed believer would ever go through with it.
You demand a costly signal. This totally reframes how I view extreme religious practices. Enduring a strict month-long fast from sunrise to sunset, or walking hundreds of miles barefoot on a grueling pilgrimage, or enduring painful rites of passage, a freeloader isn't going to do that.
No, the biological cost is way too high for a fake payoff.
Right. So if I see someone enduring that severe physical cost right alongside me, it instantly proves to me that they are completely committed to the group. It bypasses language and builds this intense, unquestionable trust among the members.
It is a biological trust verification system. And when you have a large group of people who have all endured a shared costly signal together, it generates an immense, intoxicating psychological phenomenon that the sociologist Emile Durkheim called collective effervescence.
Collective effervescence. I love this concept because you absolutely do not have to be religious to have felt this. Think about your own life, you listening to this. Think about the shared euphoria of being in the middle of a massive rock concert when the beat drops and 20,000 people are jumping up and down in the exact same rhythm, singing the exact same words.
Yes, or the shared suffering of a grueling, intense group fitness class.
Oh man, a spin class or an ultra marathon where everyone is sweating and pushing through the physical pain together. There is a moment where your sense of self, your individual ego just kind of melts away and you feel entirely merged with the group. It is an overwhelming rush of unity.
It is a profound neurological shift. The boundaries of the ego temporarily dissolve, often accompanied by a massive release of oxytocin and endorphins. Religions and cultural institutions have masterfully harnessed this biological capacity for collective effervescence for millennia to bind massive communities together.
And that leads into the larger structure.
Right, which brings us to Dalton's breakdown of multi-level selection theory. If we want to understand how religion and culture scale up to the level of empires, we have to look at it as a dynamic system operating on multiple levels simultaneously.
Let's break down that theory, because Charles Darwin actually struggled with this, right? The idea of altruism. If natural selection is just about the survival of the fittest individual, why would anyone ever sacrifice themselves for a group?
That was a massive puzzle for early evolutionary biologists. If a selfish individual is in a group with an altruistic individual, the selfish one will exploit the altruist, hoard the resources, and out-reproduce them. So on an individual level, selfishness wins.
It just makes biological sense.
But multi-level selection changes the math by zooming out. A group entirely made up of selfish individuals will tear itself apart. A group made up of highly cohesive, trusting, altruistic individuals will work together perfectly. So when Group A, the altruists, competes for resources against Group B, the selfish individuals, the cohesive group absolutely dominates.
So selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups.
Exactly. And Dalton visualizes this through a three-tiered pyramid of human organization. At the base of the pyramid, you have the individual level. This is what we discussed earlier, the single human being using hyperactive agency detection and belief to seek meaning, find comfort, and survive the terrifying reality of mortality.
The individual needs the comforting story to just stay sane and function.
Right. Moving up to the middle of the pyramid, you have the group level. This is where costly signaling and collective effervescence come in. The group uses shared rituals and shared origin stories to build immense internal trust, weed out the selfish freeloaders, and create a cohesive, altruistic unit that can outcompete other groups.
That's the social glue. And then how do we get to the empire level?
At the very top of the pyramid, you have the political and institutional level. This is where leaders, kings, and institutions step in. They look down and see these highly united, deeply trusting, cohesive groups, and they harness that power to legitimize their own authority. They map their political or territorial goals directly onto the sacred stories of the group.
That is brilliant, and it perfectly sets up the next crucial phase of our deep dive. Because once you have a massive, cohesive group formed through ritual and they have political leaders organizing them, they need a map to navigate reality. They need a shared timeline. And this is where cultural narratives step in to map out the past, the present, and the future. Let's look at the immense weight of origin stories.
Origin stories are the foundational bedrock of any society. And we have to recognize that they are never just dry historical accounts of what happened. They are deeply moral frameworks designed to instruct behavior. If you look at religious creation myths from around the globe, they almost universally set up a cosmic battle of good versus evil, light versus dark, order versus chaos. The narrative tells the believer exactly where they fit into that cosmic struggle.
And it's not just ancient religion. Secular societies do the exact same thing with national myths. I mean, think about the American origin story of the Founding Fathers, the Declaration of Independence, and the Revolutionary War, or the French Revolution with the storming of the Bastille. These narratives aren't just reciting dates and military tactics. They are anchoring a society's ethical framework.
They tell citizens who they are.
Right. They say, this is who we are, this is what we value, this is the price that was paid for your freedom, and this is where we came from.
But this raises an immensely important question, which Dalton forces us to confront: the danger of relying on a single, unchallenged narrative of the past. It is a cliche that history is written by the victors, but from a cognitive standpoint, it is entirely true. The origin stories that survive, the ones that get codified into textbooks and national holidays, are inherently filtered through the biases, the blind spots, and the political goals of the people who won the conflicts.
And just to be clear for you listening, Dalton isn't taking a political stance here, and neither are we. We are simply unpacking the mechanics of how these specific historical narratives are used to program societal values across every culture on Earth. Because historical narratives are curated by human brains.
Yes, very flawed human brains.
Exactly. When a group tells its origin story, cognitive dissonance practically guarantees that they will naturally highlight their heroism, their sacrifices, and their divine favor, while simultaneously downplaying, justifying, or entirely omitting their atrocities.
It's a mechanism for preserving group cohesion. If you admit your origin story is flawed, you risk weakening the trust at the middle level of that pyramid we discussed. But the risk for the individual is that if we passively consume a single fixed narrative of our past, we are walking around with a fundamentally distorted map of reality.
It's a dangerous blind spot.
It requires us to cultivate the habit of actively seeking out multiple, often conflicting perspectives to get closer to the truth.
The past is not a fixed objective object. It is a continuously negotiated story. But narratives don't just act as a map for the past. They act as the formatting for the future. The stories a culture tells about tomorrow actually dictate what the people living today believe is possible.
The framing of the future creates the boundaries of human action in the present. If you want to see this mechanism in action, Dalton points to how we frame global existential challenges. A prime example is the narrative surrounding climate change. And again, we're looking at the structure of the narrative here, not the underlying science.
Right, purely the narrative structure.
For years, the dominant cultural narrative surrounding climate change has been deeply, intensely apocalyptic.
It relies on terrifying visceral imagery. Melting ice caps, drowning cities, mass extinction, burning forests.
Now, while those threats are scientifically grounded, the narrative structure of an apocalypse triggers a very specific and often counterproductive psychological response.
It triggers the amygdala again, the fight, flight, or freeze response. And when the threat feels that overwhelmingly massive and the imagery is that devastating, people freeze. It causes paralyzing fear, which psychologists refer to as learned helplessness. If you feel like your actions have absolutely no impact on the outcome, your brain simply stops trying.
That is the tragedy of the apocalyptic narrative. It inadvertently strips away human agency. If the end of the world is a guaranteed, unstoppable dystopian nightmare, why bother passing complex legislation? Why bother altering our infrastructure?
Let's give up.
Right. But Dalton points out that when the narrative structure shifts, for example, to a climate justice narrative, the psychological impact on the population changes entirely.
How does that shift the psychology?
A climate justice narrative connects the environmental issues directly to human rights, poverty, and systemic inequality. It's no longer just a story about an unavoidable, faceless planetary doom. It's a story about human fairness, shared responsibility, and protecting vulnerable communities. It frames the future not as an inevitable disaster, but as a monumental moral challenge that can be met with innovation and collaboration.
It shifts the brain from learned helplessness to collective efficacy, the belief that we can actually do something about this. The structure of the story completely changes the behavioral outcome. If you tell a society the future is a dystopia, they will act with the selfishness, hoarding, and despair required to survive a dystopia. If you tell them the future is a collaborative challenge, they will begin to collaborate.
It really showcases the immense power of the storyteller. But we also have to face the shadows here. We've spent a lot of time talking about how stories and the concept of the divine can unite us, build trust, give us comfort, and give us a map of time.
Right, the positive side.
But what happens when this incredibly powerful programming goes wrong, when the source code gets corrupted or intentionally manipulated? Let's talk about the dark side, oppression, and the loss of agency.
This is where things get genuinely terrifying. We have to confront the reality of weaponized narratives. When deeply held religious beliefs and cultural norms fuse together perfectly, they create a worldview that doesn't just feel like a preference. It feels absolute. It feels like unquestionable objective truth to the people inside that narrative bubble.
And when you have two different groups, each holding an unquestionable absolute origin story, and those stories inevitably clash, say, over the ownership of the same piece of sacred land or the dominance of a specific political system, those narratives stop being social glue and they become literal weapons.
Because you aren't just fighting an enemy army over resources anymore. The narrative has escalated the stakes to the cosmic level. You are fighting the enemies of God. You are fighting the enemies of destiny. This is how you justify horrific violence. The narrative allows people to commit atrocities while completely bypassing their normal human empathy, because the story tells them the other group isn't even fully human.
It is the darkest, most destructive manifestation of multi-level selection. At the top of the pyramid, political leaders and institutions actively harness the deeply ingrained religious and cultural narratives to legitimize war, genocide, and systemic oppression. And Dalton points out that this is where the danger of extreme anthropomorphism really rears its head.
Walk me through that connection. How does our tendency to project human traits onto the universe lead to oppression?
Remember earlier when we discussed how we create gods in our own image to make the terrifying universe feel relatable? Well, if a society views the divine not as a mystery, but as a hyper-powerful human dictator, a king in the sky with a fragile ego who demands absolute loyalty, favors one specific tribe, and brutally punishes dissent, then that society risks projecting its own worst, most toxic human prejudices onto the divine. History is littered with tragic examples of this exact projection.
The divine right of kings in Europe is a perfect example of this. You have monarchs claiming absolute, unquestionable, tyrannical power over peasants because, supposedly, God ordained it.
Or the historical use of religious texts to justify the institution of slavery, or the brutal subjugation of women across multiple cultures. If a leader can convince a population that their specific political prejudice or desire for power is actually a divine mandate from an anthropomorphic God, they can justify almost any atrocity. The narrative acts as a shield against any moral criticism.
Okay, but if this puppet master god is used by leaders to justify their actions, how does that affect the individual believer on the ground? Do they just project that same aggression onto their neighbors? Here's where it gets really interesting, because Dalton points out a massive paradox here. By relying entirely on this hyper-powerful, meticulously controlling version of the divine, human beings can actually develop a profound sense of apathy.
The loss of human agency. It is a psychological trap created by externalizing your locus of control.
I find this absolutely fascinating because if you truly believe that every single event, every devastating hurricane, every disease, every political victory, every famine is meticulously, intentionally orchestrated by a divine puppet master and that it's all in God's hands, then what is the point of human initiative?
Exactly. Why try to cure a complex disease if it was sent as a divine test? Why try to negotiate a complex peace treaty if the conflict is preordained by cosmic plan?
We lose our drive to solve real-world problems because we've convinced ourselves that the script is already written and we are just actors hitting our marks on a stage. We hand over our own power, our own ability to change the world to an external authority that we basically created in our own image to begin with.
It creates a passive, fatalistic outlook, and this connects directly to how we view ourselves. Because this phenomenon, projecting our internal reality outward, creating a narrative, and then internalizing it to shape our own behavior, it doesn't just happen on a grand cosmic scale or in geopolitical conflicts. It happens every single day, in the most mundane moments of our lives, and most devastatingly in the deepest recesses of our own minds. Let's shift our focus to the inner mirror.
The inner mirror. Because we don't just project these narratives onto historical events or weather patterns, we project them directly onto the people sitting right next to us.
Dalton refers to this as everyday anthropomorphism. We do this constantly, usually without realizing it. Think about the theory of mind again. Our relentless biological drive to understand the intentions and thoughts of others? Because our brains are so hungry for meaning, so desperate for a coherent narrative, we invent elaborate stories about other people's internal states based entirely on our own subjective fears and insecurities.
Oh man, think about your own daily routine. Let's say you're at the office, your coworker walks past your desk, you smile and say good morning, and they just kind of grunt, avoid eye contact, and keep walking. Immediately, your brain spins up a narrative. They are mad at me. I messed up that presentation yesterday and now they hate me. They are probably talking to the boss, trying to sabotage my promotion. You have written a complete multi-act play assigning intent, motive, and malice to this person.
When the reality could simply be that their toddler kept them up all night with a fever, they have a massive migraine, and they are desperately trying to get to the coffee machine. They aren't thinking about you at all.
But I've already reacted to them as if my made-up story is objective truth. I'm projecting my own internal fear of inadequacy, my own imposter syndrome onto them. I'm seeing them entirely through the filter of my own subjectivity. I am anthropomorphizing them in the sense that I am attributing highly specific, complex, narrative-driven motivations to them that only exist in my own head.
And that causes unnecessary friction and conflict in our daily lives. But the most devastating part of this projection isn't what we do to our coworkers or our friends, it's what we do to ourselves. And this is where Dalton's research bridges anthropology and modern clinical psychology in a way that I think is truly profound. We talked earlier about how societies internalize the image of God. Well, if a person is raised in a cultural or religious narrative that features a harsh, deeply judgmental, punishing, and hypercritical deity, they often internalize that exact image as their own inner critic.
It is a direct psychological mirroring. The external narrative becomes the internal monologue. If you are raised in a system that constantly tells you that you are inherently flawed, that you are born broken, that you are being watched at all times by an invisible eye for any minor infraction, and that failure results in ultimate eternal punishment, that doesn't just stay a theoretical, theological concept.
It literally wires the neural pathways of your self-perception. It alters the default mode network in your brain.
What's the default mode network?
It's the part of your brain that activates when you aren't focused on a specific task. It's the network responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and that constant inner monologue. If that network is programmed by a punitive cultural narrative, your default state becomes self-surveillance and shame.
I passionately believe this is one of the most overlooked aspects of modern mental health. So many of us struggle with severe, debilitating self-criticism. We deal with crushing guilt, impossible perfectionism, and self-sabotaging behaviors. And we go to therapy and we try to figure out why we are so incredibly hard on ourselves. What Dalton's research is saying is that you haven't just memorized a cultural rule. You have literally installed a hypercritical deity into your brain's default operating system.
Yes.
You are playing the role of a punishing God against yourself. We've installed a dictator in our own minds, constantly watching our every move and demanding an impossible standard of perfection.
That internal pressure is immense, and it takes a massive biological toll. It triggers a chronic release of cortisol, the stress hormone, which fuels anxiety, depression, and physical burnout. You are running an ancient script of divine retribution, but you are playing both roles. You are the punisher and the punished. Recognizing that this harsh inner voice is not an objective truth, but rather a projected, internalized narrative that you absorbed from your cultural surroundings is the very first step in dismantling it.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this entire deep dive. If we are completely surrounded by these manipulative cultural stories, if our biology is literally hardwired by evolution to fall for them, and if we've internalized these harsh scripts to the point where they are causing us mental anguish, how do we break out of the matrix? How do we stop being the passive characters in a story we didn't write and start becoming the authors?
Dalton argues that the answer lies in cultivating what might be the most crucial, non-negotiable skill for the 21st century, narrative literacy.
Narrative literacy. It sounds like a class they should teach in high school alongside calculus and biology. What exactly does it entail?
Narrative literacy is the conscious, active ability to critically analyze and evaluate the stories we encounter every single day. It is the practice of looking under the hood of the media, the historical traditions, the political rhetoric, and the religious doctrines we consume. It means pausing and asking critical questions. Who is telling this story? What specific values are they trying to program into my behavior? What historical context or alternative perspectives are they intentionally leaving out? Who benefits from me believing this narrative, and who is marginalized or harmed by it?
It's moving from being a passive consumer of culture to an active, critical participant. You stop swallowing the code and you start reading the code. But it also requires a fundamental shift in how we approach the concept of the unknown. We talked about how we try to cram the infinite mystery of the universe into an anthropomorphic, human-sized box just so our savannah brains can handle the terror of it. How do we unlearn that biological instinct?
By consciously embracing mystery and humility. If we connect this to the bigger picture, true wisdom is realizing the profound limitations of the human mind. Dalton references various mystical traditions, from Sufism and Islam to Christian mysticism to Zen Buddhism. These traditions often employ something called apophatic theology, or the via negativa.
The via negativa.
Right. Instead of claiming to know exactly who God is and what God wants, they focus on what the divine is not. They actively embrace paradox and ambiguity. They prioritize direct, quiet experience over rigid, dogmatic, weaponizable belief systems. They teach that it is not only okay to not have all the answers, but that the arrogant insistence on having absolute, unquestionable answers is the root source of most human suffering and violence.
Being comfortable with the unknown, letting go of the desperate need to have a neat, tidy, human-centered narrative for every single thing that happens in the world.
Exactly. And this requires us to fundamentally change how we view religion, myth, and culture. We have to move past this juvenile, deeply unhelpful binary debate, where one side screams religion is purely good, the source of all morality, and the other side screams religion is purely bad, a virus of the mind and the root of all war.
Because the reality, based on all the cognitive and evolutionary science we've unpacked today, is that religion and culture are tools. They are incredibly, terrifyingly powerful tools that leverage our deepest biological wiring. A hammer can be used to build a hospital that saves lives, or it can be used to shatter a window and cause harm. We must recognize the immense power of these narrative tools and consciously, deliberately choose to use them responsibly.
And that means we can't just stop at deconstruction. It's very easy to just sit around dismantling bad stories, criticizing toxic historical narratives, and being a cynic. But we have to engage in the much harder, much more vital work of rewriting the code. Through neuroplasticity, we know that the brain can change. We have to actively create new stories.
We have to write new source code. We need to amplify marginalized voices to ensure our historical maps are accurate and not just written by the victors. We need to cultivate profound self-compassion to rewire the default mode network and quiet that punitive inner critic. We need to build external narratives that inspire collaboration rather than apocalyptic apathy, and internal narratives that empower us to act with agency in our own lives.
We all have the power to be storytellers. When you truly realize that the boundaries of human society, the structures of our institutions, and the limits of our own self-worth are largely built on imagination, you realize that imagination is the most powerful force on Earth. With narrative awareness, you are no longer a victim of your cultural programming.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We have been on an epic journey today. We started by looking at ancient human brains, spotting intentional faces in the rustling savanna bushes just to survive. We uncovered the hidden synaptic Pavlovian programming in the moral parables we tell our children. We saw how the shared sweat and sacrifice of costly rituals forged the social glue that built massive empires, and how the origin stories of those empires can be manipulated and weaponized. We even looked into the inner mirror to see how a harsh cultural deity can become the punishing, cortisol spiking voice of our own inner critic.
It is a vast, invisible matrix of biological impulses and cultural narratives, perfectly seamlessly intertwined. But the most important takeaway from Dalton's research is that you are now armed with narrative awareness. You can see the code.
The software running the world is no longer invisible to you. So the next time you feel a flash of paralyzing, irrational fear about the future, or the next time you catch yourself being viciously, overly harsh about a simple, honest mistake you made at work, take a breath, pause, and ask yourself, whose story is playing in your head right now? Are you the author of that narrative? Or are you just running an ancient piece of survival script that you never actually signed up for? You have a pen now? What story are you going to write tomorrow?